Hey, everybody. Welcome to Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Vasugian. On our show today, tensions between the U.S. and Cuba are running high after a firefighting Cuban territorial waters that the Cuban ministry says left 4 people dead. But first, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton faced questions today in front of the House Oversight Committee about her potential ties to the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. The deposition took place behind closed doors in her hometown of Chappaqua, New York. In her opening statement, Clinton said this: "I do not recall ever encountering Mr. Epstein. I never flew on his plane or visited his island, homes, or offices." Secretary Clinton has not been accused of any wrongdoing, nor has she been charged with any crime related to Epstein. But most of Secretary Clinton's 4-page statement was a takedown of the committee and what she called, quote, "an institutional failure designed to protect one political party rather than seek truth or justice for the victims." For this, I want to bring in NBC News Chief Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles, who's in Chappaqua for us. Hey, Ryan.
Hey, Yas.
I want to start with this statement, and I read some of it, but she told them essentially what they should be doing versus asking her, for instance, to testify in front of the committee. She said, quote, "If the majority was serious, it would not waste time on fishing expeditions. There is too much that needs to be done." And then she basically lays out the to-do list, the things that they should be doing. Talk more about the opening statement that we heard from former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and the tone it set for the hearing today.
So I don't think that there's any doubt that many of the points that she made have merit. And I do think that there are many arguments to be made and potential criticisms that can be made about the way this committee is conducting its work, and that in many ways it's more of a political exercise than it is a true investigatory enterprise. Now, I think any of the specific questions that they have for her likely could have been asked and answered in a written Q&A or something along those lines. But the Bill Clinton of it all, I think, is an inescapable issue that Democrats have to reconcile with. And I think you've seen that committee Democrats recognize that. They have not stood in the way of this deposition process. They believe that he should come in and answer questions. And I think to a certain extent, Hillary Clinton is kind of along for the ride because of their marital connection. There were a couple of substantive points that I think they hit on today. There is the role of the Clinton Global Initiative and Maxwell and Epstein being pretty significant donors to that effort. And what the secretary told them is that she was not involved in CGI during that period of time because she was still serving in the United States Senate. And then they also wanted to know about how Ghislaine Maxwell ended up at Chelsea Clinton's wedding, which the secretary explained was through a friend of a friend, basically. But outside of that, there really isn't any sort of tangible link between Hillary Clinton and Jeffrey Epstein other than Bill Clinton. And I think that the real meat of this conversation is probably going to happen tomorrow.
Right. And I'm glad you said that. Obviously, for folks that don't know, Hillary Clinton is day 1. Bill Clinton is day 2, testifying in front of the House Oversight Committee. You talked about some of what we learned inside this hearing today. To be completely forthcoming, it is still ongoing as you and I are having this conversation. But what more has come out so far?
Well, one of the interesting things that happened really had nothing to do with the tangible aspects of the investigation. Republican Congresswoman Lauren Boebert decided to snap a kind of covert photo of Secretary Clinton and send it to a conservative influencer who then posted the picture online. And that led to the Clintons asking for the deposition to be paused so that they could go over the rules of the game again. If you'll remember, it was the Republicans who wanted this deposition to be held behind closed doors and then a full video and transcript released after the fact. So it is a bit ironic that it was a Republican that leaked a photo of Secretary Clinton and that she leaked it to a conservative influencer. That seemed to be a minor hiccup in the process overall. But I don't think that there was necessarily anything, or will it be anything, uncovered throughout the course of this conversation today that will necessarily open up new investigative lines or create more or additional questions about really getting to the point of this investigation, which is to provide accountability and transparency for the survivors.
If we walk through what we know so far about the relationship that Bill Clinton had with Jeffrey Epstein, We know, as you mentioned, right, Ghislaine Maxwell was at Chelsea Clinton's wedding. There are flight logs in which Bill Clinton's spokesperson has said that he traveled on Epstein's plane 4 times in 2002 and 3 on trips for the Clinton Foundation. There are undated photographs of Bill Clinton with Epstein and co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell that were released in December in the first release of documents made public under the Epstein Files Transparency Act. In Bill Clinton's 2024 memoir, he wrote, "I wish I had never met him," with regards to Epstein, and he had no inkling, quote unquote, of Epstein's crimes. And then in an interview with Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche last year, Maxwell said that, quote, "President Clinton was my friend, not Epstein's friend," and that she was the one who asked Epstein to let Bill Clinton and other foundation members and guests use his plane back in 2002. What are lawmakers telling you they want to get out of this thing? What do they want to walk away with after hearing testimony?
So I think the biggest thing that the committee members, both Republican and Democrat, want to hear from Bill Clinton is a fulsome description of his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. You know, his explanation in his memoir, Ghislaine Maxwell's testimony to Todd Blanche, which I think under any circumstances has to be taken with a grain of salt, and the limited amount of data that we have from the Epstein files don't really in any way, shape, or form tell us the whole story. And so I think there will be some very pointed questions about how often did you see him? What type of social interaction did you have with him? Were there ever young women around? Were you ever introduced to a young woman? These are all questions that Bill Clinton's never answered, and they're questions that he's going to have to answer under oath. And I also think it's important to keep in mind, and the Democrats have really, at the beginning of this process of trying to bring Bill and Hillary Clinton in, there was kind of a degree of skepticism and a degree of pushback. But then at one point, the light bulb went off and they said, well, if we bring Bill Clinton in, first of all, A, it's a demonstration that we are truly in search of transparency regardless of party ideology. But B, it will set a precedent that will eventually land at the feet of Donald Trump. And the issue here for Democrats, yes, is that they can't go in and softball these questions to Bill Clinton and just let him off the hook. They're going to have to ask him every tough question that they also may want to ask Donald Trump, because the information that's available in the files, they're not exactly the same, but they're somewhat similar between both Clinton and Trump. And both men have given the same excuses as it relates to Jeffrey Epstein. I barely knew him. As soon as I found out that he was kind of a creep, I told him to get out of my life. I wish I'd never met him. They're actually kind of eerily similar. So, and you've also seen President Trump himself kind of raise his eyebrows about Bill Clinton being here. So I think he's going to get some tough questions, and I think they're going to be very specific questions, and one he's going to have an explanation for, and one he can't lie about because he's going to be under oath.
Ryan, you talk about how we have only learned so much from the release of these Epstein files. It seems as if there is so much more to learn. The degree to which these relationships took place, how long they went on for, right? And talking about former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers just resigning from Harvard University, former British ambassador to the U.S., Peter Mandelson, arrested. A Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist from Columbia has stepped down from a top post there. Others are also subsequently under investigation. The committee interviewed Les Wexner last week, the billionaire. Are these other individuals I just talked about going to be called as well? Is that what is in the plan for this committee?
So the first answer to that question is, I think the number one name that we should be focusing on in the immediacy is Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary. There are not many people that are buying his explanation about his relationship with Epstein. He emphatically stated on a podcast, which you and I have talked about, that he cut all ties with him in 2005. His first interaction with him, he thought he was a creep, but then there's all this evidence that they went to his island with his family, that he was attempting to try and create some sort of business relationship. And today, before the Republicans went in, they were specifically asked about Lutnick, and Nancy Mace, who's a member of the Oversight Committee, suggested that she was going to push to bring Lutnick in for questions. And so I do think that there's a realm of possibility where Lutnick is called before the committee to answer some of these questions. You know, he's a member of the cabinet, so he's required to be brought in front of Congress on a regular basis, just in an oversight capacity. They would be well within their rights to call him in and to have him testify. So I think that would be the first name to look for. I also think Kathy Rumler, who we've talked about, The former Obama White House counsel, who's been forced to step down for her job at Goldman Sachs, is someone that I think could be brought forward in the near future. We know for sure already on the books are depositions with the former CPA and lawyer attorney for Jeffrey Epstein. In terms of Donald Trump, I do not think it is impossible that he is called before the committee. My question is, when could that possibly happen? Do Democrats want to do something as bold if they win back the majority in November, subpoena him while he's still in office? I think that might be problematic and difficult and may not actually work for them politically. But man, the second he leaves office, if they're still in charge, why wouldn't they call him forward, especially if the Epstein controversy is still something that is a hot button issue in this country?
I got one more for you, Ryan, because I know that your time is tight here as you're posted up there in Chappaqua, New York. And it's also something that Hillary Clinton mentioned in her opening statement. We know what we have, but there are also questions about what we don't have. According to an NBC News analysis of the Epstein files and information from a source familiar with the investigation, the Department of Justice has not released summaries and notes from 3 separate interviews that the FBI conducted with a South Carolina woman who alleged that she was a sexual assault victim of Jeffrey Epstein and also made sexual abuse allegations against President Donald Trump. What do we know about these documents, and what have we heard from the DOJ?
So what we know is that these interviews took place. There were 4 interviews in total. The contents of 1 are available in the public files that have been released. The 3 others are listed on a manifest, which show that the interviews took place, but the documents themselves are nowhere to be found. Now, the Department of Justice has said that they have released everything that they're legally allowed to release, as according to the statute, the Epstein Transparency Act, but they've not addressed the substance of those 3 interviews and the information contained in those 3 interviews specifically. And they've also gone out of their way to say there were a number of claims prior to the 2016 election that were made about President Trump that were unfounded and, were essentially a political attack against him. So we don't know what's in these interviews, but we know that this woman exists. The sense that I'm getting from the committee is that there's an effort to reach out to her and talk to her to see if she would be willing to tell her story on some level. There's something to this, Yasmin, but what it is and the form and fashion that it will eventually manifest itself, I think remains an open question, but there does seem to be a degree of evasiveness from the Department of Justice as to how they're handling this, and it's something that Democrats want answers about.
Ryan Nobles, I know you got a busy day. I will talk to you again tomorrow when former President Bill Clinton testifies in front of the House Oversight Committee.
All right, I'm done here Friday night in Chappaqua. I'm going to come stay. You got room for me with your kids at your house in
exactly. On the way.
New York.
Anytime, buddy. Anytime. In a break from the deposition, California Congressman Robert Garcia said he is asking for reporters to be allowed into the room for Friday's hearing with former President Bill Clinton. And we are back with Here's the Scoop from NBC News. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the U.S. is investigating an incident in Cuban territorial waters on Wednesday. Cuba says its military killed 4 people in a U.S.-flagged boat after they opened fire on the military. The Interior Ministry says they were Cuban residents of the United States and were planning to carry out terrorist action inside the country. It's coming at a time when tensions are already high between the United States and Cuba, and the country is in a full-blown economic and humanitarian crisis. And after the U.S. captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in January, President Trump warned that Cuba could be in trouble. So for this, I want to bring in NBC Nightly News Saturday anchor and Telemundo anchor, José Diaz-Balart, to talk about what this incident could mean for U.S.-Cuba relations. Hi, Jose.
Hi, Yasmin. Great seeing you.
Good to see you. So all that we know of what took place yesterday in the waters surrounding Cuba are what Cuba is telling us. What are they saying happened?
So there's been a small evolution in what the regime spokespeople have been saying about it. Initially, they said that their Americans may have been involved, and later that 10 people that were Cuban citizens living in the United States were planning some terrorist attack, and that they were intercepted on what they call a speedboat, and that they were confronted, and that according to the Cuban government, they received incoming and then they responded, killing 4. Well, at least 6 were taken in. Some of those were injured and taken to the hospital.
What are we learning, Jose, from Cuban officials about these 10 individuals?
So far, that they are Cuban citizens living in the United States. They have said, interestingly enough, just today in South Florida, one of the people that is listed by the Cuban government as being injured in that incident is actually in South Florida. And he's been speaking to Telemundo and others saying, hey, I'm on the list, but I'm here. I'm not injured. So there are discrepancies. And so, you know, when the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, which you just mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, calls for an independent investigation, it's because there has to be a way to see what actually happened, if something did happen, and who is behind that.
The U.S. and Cuba, as you well know, Jose, have had a very long-standing rocky relationship, and that is putting it mildly. But as of the last few months or so, things have been incredibly tense, especially after what took place in Venezuela with the removal of the leader there, Nicolas Maduro, by the United States. There has been an ongoing blockade of oil onto the island, so there is a real lack of oil on the island right now. They are struggling economically because of that and for many other reasons as well. There is a humanitarian crisis on top of all of that. How is this all impacting the country right now?
It's a question that has the suffering and in many ways the freedom of millions of people behind it, because we're seeing in Cuba a deterioration of an economy that has been regressing since 1959. But for many years, Cuba was able to survive through the gifts of the Soviet Union that gave it and that regime millions of dollars worth of assistance for many, many years. With the end of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union's gifts to the regime also ended, and Cuba entered what was called the periodo especial, a special period. This is in the 90s, when literally people had it very difficult to find food. That was mitigated by the gift of, for the Cuban regime, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, that 25 plus years ago essentially became the new sugar daddy of the Castro regime and received, Cuba did, literally millions of barrels of oil and subsidies and gifts to the regime. That all ended the 3rd of January of this year when Hugo Chávez's successor, Nicolás Maduro, was taken out of his stronghold residence and brought to New York City, where he's going to be facing trial. So that ended on the 3rd of January. And then, as you state, then the United States said no more. And Mexico was the only other country that was giving gifts of oil to Cuba. And that has been mitigated.
And Russia is trying to break that blockade now as well.
Just yesterday, the United States announced that they were going to be permitting some humanitarian sales of oil to Cuba. But if it's coming from Venezuela, that's American controlled.
When we talk about a humanitarian crisis, when we talk about an economic crisis, give us a sense of what life looks like for Cubans right now, day to day.
Think of having no electricity for days on end. Think of not knowing where or how you will be able to feed your children. There is no gasoline. There is no power, but if you look at some of the few hotels that still remain open to international tourism, those hotels do get power. That is what the Cuban people are currently going through. And then they look outside and the garbage is just piled up like snow in New York City after a storm, but it's garbage, and you have people looking through that garbage to see if they can find something to eat. This is something that has been progressively getting worse.
José Diaz-Balart, thank you.
Thanks. It's always great seeing you.
That is going to do it for us at Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Vasugian. We'll be back tomorrow with whatever the day may bring. And if you like what you heard and you saw, press the subscribe button. We'll see you tomorrow.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.